right. Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're so excited to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate Constellations of Care, Anarcha-Feminism in Practice. It is a book by Cindy Barukh Milstein, and we're very excited to have Cindy back. We've had Cindy many times to talk about a lot of different books. Cindy is a diasporic queer Jewish anarchist and longtime organizer. They've been writing on anarchism for over 2 decades and are the author of Anarchism and Its Aspirations and Try Anarchism for Life, The Beauty of Our Circle. They edited the anthologies Rebellious Mourning, The Collective Work of Grief, and Deciding for Ourselves, The Promise of Direct Democracy, among others. So this conversation is going to be a little bit of an experiment for how we kind of share our ideas between the virtual and the in-person. So we would really love for our folks who are watching online to be as participatory as possible in the chat. We want to bring your voices into the room earlier. So as Cindy is inviting folks into the conversation, we would love for you to be sharing your ideas in the chat. So bear that in mind. Don't hang back unless you are feeling really shy, but we'd really love to have your voices in the room. So without further ado, please welcome Cindy Barukh Milstein.
Thanks to all of us. Thanks, Charis, for hosting me in this beautiful new space for me because I have not been in it yet. And everyone who showed up in person and in spirit or here, wherever you are watching from. And I really want to thank also the contributors to this book. There's dozens of writers to this in this book, but probably hundreds of voices, which I think is very anarchistic and feministic, which I'll mention. And I lastly want to thank Pluto Press, who is the publisher for this, for agreeing to, which is what I do. I never do books for money. I do them as labors of love, as part of my politics. And they kindly agreed to let me donate all the proceeds to anarchist feminist projects around the world. And I'm going to have all the contributors offer suggestions and we'll figure out where to send that money when time comes. So books to me are something that are not just this object. Unfortunately, we live in capitalism still, so they too often cost money. But how do we shake up the relationship of what books are about? And this book is meant to be and is a conversation, a dialogue through many voices, in a sense, talking to each other and sharing our stories with each other and writing our own histories as anarchist feminists. So I just kind of want to go sort of frame a few things so we can just have a conversation because I like that form better. I've been working on this book for about 2.5 years, and I always leave the prologue till the last, so I have a sense of the whole. And then October 7th happened, and as a Jew, as an anarchist, as a human being, I've been incredibly, it's been remarkably impossible time period. So many time periods are hard, but this one has felt particularly hard. And I was like, I'll never be able to write this prologue. I've lost words. I've lost voice for what to speak about. And the person at Pluto who I was like working with on this book, who was overseeing it, said, don't pretend you're not in this moment. Write from this moment and speak from this moment. And so I want to start off by saying, I hope we don't pretend that we're not in a moment of profound collective trauma, collective grief, collective rage, from the COVID period into the uprising that happened after George Floyd was murdered by police, to the genocide. And here in the United States, a Christo-fascism that I think is actually already here. We're not waiting to vote for it in the fall. And lastly, I just want to mention this moment. They're so profound to me. I feel like there's many, many moments in history that have felt this hard in different ways, but there's something profoundly extra hard about this moment when we're contemplating a fascism sweeping the whole world and statist and capitalist abandonment on a level we perhaps have never seen on a global level, including abandonment of any kind of an understanding of ourselves as embedded in nature and part of nature, abandoning the whole ecosystem. So yeah, on that happy note, I just wanted to read, I was trying to read a little section from, so I'm like trying to write this prologue about a book that feels care? How do we think about care in a world that feels so profoundly uncaring? And I just, like I said, was struggling with words. So I'll just read a couple of paragraphs from my prologue when I was having time writing. Across an aching world, we add our no with our feet and our solidarity. Yet it falls silently on the ears of those who only hear the siren call of hierarchy and control. So words fail me. They fail us. As one poignant essay observed recently, we're experiencing, quote, grief beyond language, unquote, which is another way of saying that we're experiencing rage beyond language, bundled up in, quote, pain and sadness so big that they no longer fit in the heart of a few, unquote, as the Zapatistas observed in a communique on January 1st, 1994, when they rose up, and instead demanded a shared collective heart. We need, as we always have, the yes of our practices, constellations of care, where each and every one of our still beating hearts in concert rebelliously speaks louder than words, forming unmistakable patterns of different cosmologies, different worlds, life against their death machine. This collection is about those practices of yes, that at once defy and disobey all forms and types of hierarchies and coercive domination, and equally model and experiment with liberatory world building aimed at systemic, radical, as in getting to the roots, social transformation, both of ourselves and forms of social organization. I don't think it's too much to say that what's at stake right now is huge. It's everything. It's life. And this book, in contrast, is trying to show how people themselves look at each other, turn to each other, and directly make and share life against that death machine, which I think is the challenge of anarcha-feminism. It's not that we are waiting to be abandoned, we already are. So if everything is falling apart, which I feel like it is, it could go in multiple directions, then it's up to us to make a choice about what direction we personally want to act in daily, routinely, intentionally, caring in small and large ways, the ways we decide that we can be both filled with care and careful in how we craft a world that's solidaristic and loving, mutualistic, many of the values that I understand to be anarchism. There's been a slogan that's kind of emerged, starting with the COVID time into now: we are all we have. And lately, people at the encampments and the liberated zones have been saying, we keep us safe. And to me, those aren't just slogans. They're at the heart of an ethic that this book asserts, and is actually just stories of people showing how they try to do that and live real practice now. Most of these stories are about really present day examples that show we really can and we really must be all we need. We really can and we really must try to keep each other as safe as we can in a very dangerous world. So I want to ease into this conversation first by what I understand to be a practice. I feel like rituals and grief, and us coming into connection with our world, not just with our heads, but with our bodies, with our heart, with our spirits, is really contesting this death machine. So I want to light some candles to begin. And I do that to mourn our dead, and to visibilize our dead, and to honor our dead, from Gaza to Tortuguita, here with Stop Cop City, from anarchist friends of mine that have been lost recently, some well-known like Khalid Benali, who probably has a book here, just came out just before Khalid's death, and to lesser-known anarchists like my dear, dear friend Clarissa Rogers, sorry, they only died recently, who was an anarchist that people didn't know very well, but spent the bulk of her life putting anarchist feminist practices into deep, deep care, into deep, deep practice. So it also happens to be Shabbat soon when twilight comes, and usually you do light 2 candles on Shabbat. I can't blow it out because I'm gonna make it. And so I'll do that for Shabbat too, because what Shabbat is all about is the next 24 hours of ushering in the world we want, the world to come, practicing what it means to live in a space that's not this world. And I take that challenge really seriously each week. So maybe for the next 25 hours, no matter what our faith or lack of faith, we can think about what does it mean to set aside time for our bodies and minds and hearts to envision the yes this book is talking about. I was going to play a song, but it's 5 minutes long, and I encourage you to listen to it later, by Kimya Dawson, whose work is really lovely. And it was a song called Utopian Futures. It's 5 minutes long. Utopian Futures. And Kimya talks about all sorts of little practices that people engage in day after day after day in the whole space of our life where we make the world. And at the end of the song, it talks about we are the people who inhabit all those, quote, places where dreams aren't dead. I really like that. Places where dreams aren't dead, because so many of us spend so much time trying with our whole body and mind and heart and spirit to carve out lives worth living, in really radical, which to me means at the root. So I'm just going to read another little excerpt that gets at some of that. This is by a dear friend, Shuli Branson. It's called Transition and Autonomy. They're also another anarchist writer. They wrote a piece. Yeah, I said the name, Transition and Autonomy. They were looking at anarchistic feminist practices around bodily autonomy. The lie is that centralized state solutions are easy, efficient, and better in terms of supplying people with what they need. In truth, bureaucracy just keeps the messiness out of the spotlight until you try to get something done. Then, alongside the direct violence of the state, one experiences death by a million paper cuts while trying to get insurance coverage, food stamps, unemployment, or a name change, or death by the abandonment of an already unreliable resources. This is increasingly clear right now as the state ups its attacks on bodily autonomy, using policies and courts to eviscerate trans-affirming care and abortion access. As anarchists, in contrast, the way we do things, bottom up, not top down, is about living, how we choose to relate to each other, how we choose love and relationships over individualized endeavor and competition, how we choose to care even when that means working in the cracks and gray areas. Such care work is often done by feminized people, and as feminist organizers have long pointed out, frequently neglected, made invisible, or not seen as the real work of movements. Yet it is, and it always has been, a crucial form of direct action, just as militant and risky as confronting police, fascists, and other coercive infrastructure in the streets. So, which I'm going to briefly touch on. So, what is anarchism? My friend Shuli just talked about a little bit about that, but in a nutshell, I want to, because this book is Constellations of Care, Anarcha-Feminism in Practice, and it looks at other values that anarcha-feminist puts into practice besides just care. But there is something distinct about anarchism. Briefly, anarchism is kind of twofold. It is a overarching critique of all forms of control over, hierarchy, coercive domination, any other way you want to put structures of power over, where some people have the ability, the power, the mechanisms to lord over others and do violence against them in various ways. And that's all sorts of forms. So anarchism is looking at all sorts of things, trying to kind of, is that an example of power over? Crucially, that means that anarchism then is an abolitionist politics. It wants to abolish all forms of those control overs, those hierarchies. And it looks largely at gigantic structures, colonialism, capitalism, states, borders, police, prisons, all encompassing, and understands that they're all interrelated, and you can't just not have capitalism but still have a state. You can't just not have a state but still have capitalism. Whether we can actually achieve getting rid of all those things is another story. But the idea is anarchists are always trying to disperse power down back to people so we all can decide our lives for ourselves. Because it is abolitionist, it's inherently oppositional or conflictual, or maybe a better way to say it's always kind of working at cross purposes with the world as it's structured right now. So one phrase that came out when Trump was the first time Trump was running for office for president was become ungovernable. Anarchists were putting that on banners, and in a sense, what it meant was don't follow what the state says, don't follow what capitalism says or patriarchy or colonialism is. Figure out what we can do instead, which leads me to the second part of anarchism, which I think you can't understand anarchism without this. It's not literally just a no, it is a yes, a profound yes to a vision of what could and should be if we didn't live in a world that was distorted and perverted and destroyed and actually is a death machine because of hierarchy and domination. So anarchism is a politics of freedom. Its aspiration is freedom and liberation for all, so everyone can not just survive but thrive, can become who they want to be in communities they want, and that would look different everywhere based on who we would want to be. And I really, again, encourage you to listen to that Kimya Dawson song. I don't know what Kimya's politics are, but so I don't want to impose an anarchism on, but there's some beautiful lines in there. It's like, what would it feel like to live in a place where we can all be whatever body we want to be and have whatever name we want to have and not have to worry about property relations and share everything in common? Like, how would that feel? Anarchists really deeply believe that we can do that and that that's the life we should aspire to, and we're not willing to settle for anything less. And to settle for anything less is actually what's unrealistic. Right now, we're in a time when most people are asking someone to stop the genocide in Gaza. And we're watching a time when states or international agencies or no one's willing to stop that genocide in Gaza. And we can't rely, it's unrealistic to think we can rely on these structures of violence and power and domination to stop doing the domination and the violence. But what we can rely on is us to take care of each other, the solidarity beyond borders, which doesn't maybe stop the profound violence that's in the works, right? We may not be able to stop that genocide, which is, I think, what makes this time period so brutally heartbreaking, to have to watch, to be such caring human beings and to have to watch live streamed a genocide that is so clearly wrong. Or in the United States, to have to watch people murdered by police, and we know it's so clearly wrong, and yet there's police. But we can, as we've seen in the liberated zone and the encampments, in very feministic, caring, collectively caring, solidaristic ways, we can directly decide to take care of each other and not let the police hurt as many. We can try to de-arrest each other. We can try to do things that on the level of what it looks like to begin to form constellations of care, we can enact things that already point toward a world past police or past states or past genocide, right? So that's anarchism's vision, which to me is the presence of us self-determining, the presence of self-organization, the presence of self-governance, the presence of a whole bunch of ethics put into lived, prefigurative practice, meaning modeling now the world we hope would become more and more the world we want, acting as if we are already free, acting as if we all have worth, right? And we take direct actions to live out that beautiful ethical compass. And so for anarchists, that's all sorts of values like mutual aid, not charity, solidarity directly with each other, not waiting for other entities to come in and intervene to save us, voluntary association, collective care, a life in common, a whole bunch of other ethics. All of these are what anarchism understands itself as basically a do-it-ourselves infrastructure of profound, direct care of each other without expecting some entity above us to do that. But because of patriarchy, toxic masculinity, heteronormativity, misogyny, structures of violences that we all understand, those of us who are not all those structures impact all our bodies, and they end up in creating systems, whether that's militarism or Christo-fascism, or they end up, creating, telling children that they can't go in certain bathrooms because they have certain bodies. They end up doing all sorts of things, and we understand that. And in our own circles, until we live in a world without racism, all of us will have elements of white supremacist behaviors. Until we live in a world without patriarchy, there will still be patriarchal forms of behaviors, right? Which doesn't mean we're all horrible patriarchs. It just means there's gradations of that. So anarchism, in a sense, shouldn't need feminism. But until there's a world without all those structures which we're working toward, even in a politics that advocates profoundly deep forms of transformative social relationships and social organization that are about freedom, we're still going to find out that we need feministic values. So when I understand, I'm going to read a short little bit. Stop again. And this is from Nicole Rose, who wrote a piece about something called Solidarity Apothecary, which is they do plant medicine, and they do it beyond prison walls. They do it in and outside prison for folks that are incarcerated. They themselves are incarcerated, and they start out by picking plants up in the prison yard and creating healing medicine. And then now they do a book that they send into prisons that helps people do the same. But they also set up solidarity apothecaries at borders when people are being forced against their will across borders. Very feministic, beautiful project of care. So I'll just read a little thing. So they do plant medicine. Plant medicine gave me the opportunity to see that our work for liberation is not just about social war, but also about healing. Indeed, developing and experimenting with collective transformational ways to heal actually is the work. In an abolitionist context, this can mean searching for forms of healing that don't involve re-imprisonment or further state violence. It can and should involve recognizing that abolitionist work is as much about trauma recovery as it is about resistance, that reclaiming life from trauma is resistance. Recovery must be a politicized practice and collective endeavor. It can mean engaging in methods of healing that build mutual aid and reconnection, solidarity, and social relationships. Care is a radical act and one of our biggest weapons. Collective care points beyond all the structures we fight against, while simultaneously embodying the alternatives we fight and yearn for. Yet for too long, the centrality of care to life itself has been downplayed or erased, including within anarchist circles. Anarcha-feminists have challenged the invisibilization of care, even as they've typically been the ones to engage in the myriad types of care work that form the backbone of anarchist infrastructure and are essential to everything that anarchists believe in and practice. I was kind of joking on May Day when people were like, the anarchist holiday where nobody's supposed to work because we're fighting for a world without work, that if anarchists removed all of our care, if we had a day without anarchist labor in any kind of social movements, those social movements will not have medics. They would not have people doing jail support. They would not have most food. They would not have basically a huge amount of the infrastructure of care. Mostly anarchistic folks, that is what they do. They will not tell you they're an anarchist when they're at liberating zones and encampments or outside jails. But there's a sensibility that says we don't have to wait for some professional to come do this. We can give each what we need. If you actually took away all that labor, you would have almost no anarchists left. You would also have not infrastructure of care left in movements. But yet still, in the anarchist world, among anarchists too often devalue that part of anarchism, but anarchism is almost nothing without it. If that makes sense. Right? But outside of anarchism, other people devalue it. Oh, anarchists, what do? They're just like, they just like occasionally dress up in, black and riot, or they break windows, or they do that. These stereotypes, which are a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a tactic, versus here we are in Atlanta where Stop Cop City happened. Not that everyone was an anarchist within Stop Cop City, but when you were in that forest, it was this magical infrastructure of feministic, anarchistic, everything for everybody and people caring for each other, which doesn't mean everybody was cared for as much as they wanted to be or could be or should be. But the difference of what it felt like when you walked into those woods versus when you were out of it was palpable, was substantive. It felt like the difference of walking from a society where you were alone and abandoned and uncared for into a society where you're held in a web or an abundance of care, as one person put it, who was part of Cop City, was written beautifully about that, an abundance of care. And that is too often that labor has always been visibilized when it's always seen done by feminized people, which doesn't necessarily relate to a specific body type. In this book, I don't, it's very queer and trans. You didn't have to have a specific body to be engaging in anarchistic feministic practices. You didn't even have to be, say you were an anarchist or a feminist. Many people in this book did not want to call themselves feminist, which leads me to the other side of the equation. What is feminism? And I don't pin that down in this. I let the pieces speak for themselves. So many people in so-called United States did not want to call themselves feminists that are anarchist, even though they understand they're doing feministic practices, because they're like, here, that word has no meaning. It's become used mostly by liberals. It's been used mostly in either racist ways or classist ways or reformist ways. It's not anything that I understand I want to associate with, even though I do those practices. The pieces in here that are written by people not in the United States were like, we absolutely want to claim that term feminism. Do you understand the violence that is done on feminized people's bodies, on people who still understand themselves as women, statistically skewed whose bodies violence is perpetrated on, and statistically skewed who has to do labor that is demeaned, devalued, erased, invisibilized? So I'll let you decide. But in this book, it's saying we do not want a liberal feminism that is trying to be a band-aid. Neither do we want an anarchism that doesn't care about social relations of care and doesn't value that. How do you bring those two things together? And how do you queer them and transition them or make them transformational through the lens of a trans politics, which opens up the understanding that we, instead of being tied to a specific understanding of what gender is, we are a wholeness of who we want to be. Because ultimately, to me, fighting for life and freedom is about us fighting to become whole human beings. So none of us look at each other and see a list of categories. We look at each other and we see the fullness of who each of us is because we feel full, right? And so that feels like a really qualitative difference. So in this book, it tries to bring together all those things and not come up with some neat definition, but the messy beauty of what it looks like in practice to have an anarchistic, feministic, queered way of caring for each other without hierarchical structures. What does that look like? So there's all these different little stories in here. I'll try to wrap up and we can just have a little bit of a conversation on what a social fabric of mutualistic reciprocity looks like when we're all trying to be free together and give each other everything we need. There's one piece, I'll read a teeny bit from that. I'll just read a few more little bit of excerpts and we can stop. There's one piece that it was one of the earlier pieces that I got by some folks who are doing Anarcha-Feminist library, explicitly anarchist feminist library in Toulouse, France. And they talk about how they had to fight to start it and how they keep it open, and they're still around, which unfortunately, when you do a book, it takes 2.5, 3 years to do this book. Some projects are not here anymore. But one section I really liked, let me see if I can, a little section they had was on doing nothing and all the work it entails. And there we stand on the threshold, the anarcha-feminist librarians. It is peculiar indeed to act the part. Sometimes the best thing to do is nothing at all. Strangely, this may take more work than you would expect. This may seem a little weird at first. We organize because we want to do things after all, usually a whole lot of things. But one of our goals at the library is to create a space for others, a space where people can come explore, experiment, and enjoy, where they're free to do their own thing and be their own full selves. So sometimes what we need to do is nothing. Move back and open up space for others to breathe. Is it worth it? Yes. When at last you sit back, sip some tea, and look at people doing their own cool stuff in the space you helped to create, it can make your heart swell with pride. And sometimes they even want to do things with you too. How cool. But that's a lot of work to get there. Because just doing nothing is not enough. You need to set up the stage a little, do some prep work. There are a lot of things to do before you can do nothing at last. And then they spend 2 or 3 pages talking about all the little details of care. And I thought about that when I walked into Charis. Details of care. People should wear masks for each other. Details of care. Telling me about how when they do these online hybrid, it's a care to make things more accessible, right? But if someone says something during the conversation thing that they don't want recorded and put up online, they're happy to edit it out so they can protect people, like being able to be human and share, and then be like, oh, I don't want to share that with everybody. Right? All these little details you can say are nothing when they're one little act. But when you bring them together in a larger, and you stitch them together, and you can sit back and someone can walk into Charis and say, why do I feel different here? Why do I feel cared for here? Why do I feel less scared here? Why do I feel all these other things? And what this book is trying to do is show those aren't things that happen accidentally. Someone put a lot of labor and a lot of thought and a lot of care. Whereas when I walk into other bookstores, nobody's wearing a mask. Nobody cares about whether I'm surveilled or recorded. Nobody's friendly, right? All these little details. Do they create a revolution on their own? No, of course they don't, right? But how do we understand, and this book moves into that, which I'll try to move toward wrapping up, how all these little practices can happen on the level of something as small as a library where it's all anarcha-feminist volunteers and they're trying to get people to like educate themselves for freedom and think it's a queer space too. They do a lot of queer organizing happens out of there and queer social things. Up to the piece I read at the beginning, which is about from my friend Shuli, which is about clandestine forms of hormone distribution and abortion beyond borders. There's another piece in the book that looks at a network of abortion, DIY abortion that happens across nation state lines in the place called Europe. And they have all sorts of ways of doing things that let people care for each other despite what borders do to shut people off from not being able to do that. Up to larger scale forms of care, a medic collective in Minneapolis that was on the streets during the uprising and talking about how are you there taking care of people in antagonism to the police and letting people do things like being able to burn down the precinct building, but not being the ones to do that, but being there to help people deal with both physical and the emotional medicing that might be needed during that. And that medic collective is still in existence and is there for all sorts of events to support and sustain all sorts of rebellions in Minneapolis. And there have been multiple, as they point out in this piece, multiple uprisings in that city because the police have killed multiple people. Up to large scale uprisings and encampments, which this book talks about, and how during that moment, who sustains the infrastructure of care. There's a piece from talking about communitarian kitchens in a lot of Latin American contexts where there's been uprisings and revolutions. And at the front line, there's communitarian kitchens where people cook for the people who are battling really intense front lines in the moment of revolutions to make sure people are fed and taken care of during those moments. Also, and then it leads into another book that I did, I was thinking about, which ties in with this, although there's no piece in this about that because I knew I had done another book on it. But in a book called Deciding for Ourselves, which a person named Delar Durek, who's a feminist, deep feminist, wrote a piece about Rojava and talked about that revolution as a feminist revolution and understanding those values, completely making that revolution so powerful in ways we can't even understand most other revolutions because of the deep feministic values. I actually recently met someone who'd been in Rojava for quite a while, fighting with the feminist brigades, and they were telling me, people are always asking the question, are they queer? Are they queer? Are they queer friendly? They're always talking about women, life, freedom, but what about non-binary people? And they're like, God, that word woman doesn't even translate to an English context. It's really stuck with me. They go, I've never seen people who are so fully who they wanted to be. And the reason they were male brigades, they would tell me oftentimes, is the person telling me this, is just one person, obviously, but they didn't think the men had become whole people yet. They were still working through things where they said, what is queer? Queer is when we can fully be who we want to be in a way that doesn't fit in a box, right? So when they say women, they mean that kind of person, not what we say here, because we're not in a revolution yet. So I want us to think about anarcha-feminism as seeming like something, when you read a lot of these stories, warm and fuzzy, making sure there's cookies or tea, or making sure that you ask consent before you help someone on a street when you're a medic, or a whole bunch of other examples. There's a beautiful piece about a thing called Shakes Queer, where a theater troupe and how they act in anarcha-feminist ways to put on their own queer version of Shakespeare each year. and support each other through all the awkwardness of learning and non-hierarchies of putting on a theater piece together. Um, there's a whole bunch of also art pieces. I've asked a lot of anarcha-feminist artists to talk about print their pieces, but also why they produce the art they do in their practices and thinking through how that changes their work. And those can all seem very warm and fuzzy. I want to read another little, and a couple little. This is by Ronnie Bagum. I'm probably mispronouncing, apologies for mispronunciation of name, who wrote a very short piece called Tarps and Gossip about a space where they literally threw down tarps in a park for housed and unhoused sex workers and drug users, and on the tarp, bring supplies and hang out and talk to each other. Okay. As sex workers and drug users, we are not seen as people able to manage ourselves in our lives. We are viewed as too stupid to care for ourselves, too airheaded to make our own decisions, too materialistic to organize ourselves, and too zombied out to defend ourselves. Institutional violence deems us not human, and this translates palpably in the ways we are treated. Rather than being stymied by it, it gives our organizing more freedom. Unlike other organizing spaces, Nightshade, that's the name, is not goal-oriented. It is instead oriented toward friendship and rest. Some of my favorite memories are of people coming to nap. Not only do we build relational trust that allows napping to happen, but we model community naps and community rests. There are also the gossip sessions. Sorry. Okay. Goes into a little bit of the beauty of gossip. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. Here I learned that some of my friends enjoyed outdoor living and scrutinized my own preoccupations about unhoused people. I've also gotten to share the different ways I work and been able to support members when they wish to transition to different parts of the erotic labor industry. In this way, our gossip covers vast terrains of politically deep conversations, stretching from race and sex work to overdose prevention sites and safe supply to encampment organizing. In this context, Nightshade is a protest too, week in and week out. Give some examples. Okay. On a quiet fall day, a cop comes over and wakes up one of our members from their nap, feigning concern over an overdose despite our vehement protest. That day, while we were unable to stop a cop from enacting violence on our autonomy and breaching our space, we modeled what community self-defense and solidarity looks like. Abolishing the police is a deeply held value. To detractors of police abolition, sex workers in the open experiencing violence may be an excellent example of why we need police as protection. But we don't. We protect ourselves from hostile neighbors and the police. We prove to ourselves that a new world is possible. So it isn't necessarily warm and fuzzy. It's being there to have naps and rest, and it's fighting back at the same time. Okay, I'm going to end on this book. The piece I did in this is called, try to remember the name. Funny how you rate things, you can remember the name. I wrote a book about sort of stitching together pieces through using a quilt beginning as it, but I have 6 or 7 little vignettes where I look in detail at a non-anarcha-feminist way of something that hurt my heart that had happened and how I and other friends had organized collectively to do it differently and try to contrast the like, here's what hurt, but here's how we can do it instead. And I really want to emphasize these pieces are about people going, you know, we can complain all day about how we don't like the world. We can be angry at it. We can be mad at it. And we can turn to each other and we can just be like, let's just do something different. And I want us to think about how that magical thing about let's just look at each other and know we can do something different with each other directly without having to ask permission is such a hurdle for people to get over. I've been doing a ton of Palestinian solidarity organizing, and every time people are, who's the group? Who's the group? I'm like, we're just some people who got together, think this is wrong, and wanted to create this space together. You could do that too. What kind of space do you want to make? But you have to say that again and again to people for people to believe it. So the last thing I want to say about this book was I put together a bunch of books, anthologies. I love the anthology form. Again, it's very feministic to my mind. You're asking other people to share their voices together and have a dialogue. I love creating anthologies where there's a dialogue happening and pieces disagree. And there's 2 or 3 pieces that talk about whether it's possible to have safe space or not. Almost all of them think no, but then they all have different ways of talking about what that looks like instead to make people feel safer. but they don't have the same conclusion. And I like that. We're wrestling with the same problems, but we're not coming to the same answer. That dialogue is what I think is such a beautiful. In this book, I never had so much trouble getting people to write pieces. I never had so much trouble getting people to believe they could write, that they mattered, that their voice mattered, to the point in which I'm not even sure this book. It's like that level of self-doubt and demeaning and invisibilizing that took place. I spent the last 3 years having conversations with so many people. For instance, one person was going to write about a project they were involved in for 10 years as part of an anarchist feminist collective, keeping alive something called a Catholic worker house, which they lived in. Everyone collaborates together on this house in this space of sharing and caring. And they said, oh, it was the best 10 years of my life. It was dreamy. It went really well. And at the end of 10 years, some cis guys came in and they're like, you're doing it wrong. You're out. We're in. And they took it over. And 5 years later, they kept trying to write about it. And they go, all I can hear is their voices in my head. And I kept going, here are the 10 years you did before that. And they couldn't right now. Right? But so many people told me I'm not, what I do has like, so how deep, it's really struck me how deep patriarchy's messages about whose voice stories account, who can write, who can speak, whether, high theory versus people just telling their stories. So this is a samplers of stories that together we can draw out theory from, but they are real, they're genuine, they're about life, worthwhile life. And they don't happen, again, I want to end on this, they don't happen accidentally. They happen by people putting huge amounts of thought and care and time into it that takes so much longer than if I just been, even though it's hard to write, if I just been like, I'm just going to do this myself and to have just my voice in it. Every single person here was like, who am I to be the only person in this story? Even when people wrote a piece by themselves, they probably have 30 or 40 voices. They had to bring in other people's stories, other people's voices. Many people wrote as collectives, and it took them a lot longer to write it. That deep sensibility that collective care, humility, sharedness matters, a deeply held ethic, I think reverberates through this book, even in the way the stories are told. So I've kind of been talking a long time. I just want to end on ultimately, I think this book, in a time that feels really impossibly hard, where most of us feel impossibly alone and being made crazy by this world, where you can't even say the word genocide. People are contesting whether a genocide is a genocide. Like what someone said to me today, I was at a friend's bookstore and someone walked in who'd never walked in before, and they just on blue, they go, this time period's really hard. What used to just be simple truths, you have to even just try to explain to people anymore, right? And so ultimately, I think this book maybe is a love letter to the fact that we can actually dream about and actually enact better worlds. And even if we're not, that we can actually try to do our part to make lives worth living in the circles we are, even if we can't change everything that's happening right now. And that's so, so important in a moment of fascism, where truth itself becomes becomes distorted beyond anything. Right? Okay. So the first piece I got, this person was so patient, some 3 years ago, literally was a love letter. So I'm going to read a teeny bit about it. And it's called Do You Feel the Same? It's about someone who lives in Finland, Vilja Saarinen. Again, I'm mispronouncing that name terribly. And they wrote this little love letter to people based on what it feels like to be an anarcha-feminist and all the little ways people care for each other. It's a teeny bit long, but I'll just read. Okay. I'll read part of it. To all who share food, water, cigarettes, and tips and tricks with those in need. To the ones who warn their fellow passengers when seeing ticket inspectors waiting on the metro platforms, or stall the inspector so as to gift the ones who haven't bought a ticket more time to escape. To all who move closer to each other in the hope of becoming a territory. To the parents who bring their kids to demonstrations. To everyone who waits outside jails and hospitals. To those who study first aid, law, and trauma support. To all who show up in the streets when it's below 15 degrees Celsius. To anyone who is housed, hidden, and helped refugees or arranged transport for them. To everyone who has ever brought food or other treasures to collective spaces so that everyone could eat. Anyone who has peeled tens of kilograms of potatoes, fried hundreds of falafel, or organized places to meet, discuss, and learn. Saved plates of food for the ones who have not returned safely. prepared meals separately for comrades with allergies, invested in collective infrastructure, been on a hunger strike. To all of those caring for collective needs or doing the right thing, even when it's risky. To all that grows under the ice in the absence of sunshine. To all struggling to unlearn patriarchy, moving back to give space, offering care, and moving forward in their work of understanding their emotions. To Danuta, Tess, and all of you standing face to face with fascist cops or other violent men and not backing down. To all who still carry the new world in their hearts. To whoever has read this far, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing you in the desire that you will share a moment of cheerful nostalgia with me. When the times are difficult, to say the least, I sometimes try to get a hold of what put us in this path in the first place and why. It helps me feel closer to the things that make my heart beat a little faster. It helps me feel close to you. Perhaps you remember the feeling that we shared when going to that first demonstration after a spring of quarantining and worrying about COVID-19, expecting a crowd of 300, but being greeted by 3,000. The feeling of something ice cold slowly melting. Like when I think back on the memory of Rika stealing the hat of an infamous racist YouTuber and then tripping when running away, yet nonetheless making it to safety, it still evokes a whole range of emotions in me. A little fear, a lot of joy, a lot of laughter. There is so much to be done. A lot has already happened. I have some confessions to make. I am secretly impressed by the determination of the schoolgirl who sat alone in front of Parliament to protest climate change until she wasn't alone anymore, and hundreds and thousands of kids and teenagers from all around the world joined her. I love all the kids who got inspired, especially that 5-year-old carrying picket signs of animals facing extinction, depicting animals the same size as them. I adore the grandmas and grandpas who were among the first to climb the riot fence in Gothenburg in 2017, after which almost 10,000 people followed their lead and blocked the route of the Nazi march. I still feel touched when I see the pictures from that day, just as I feel moved every time I watch the different videos from many continents after the Chilean feminist collective La Tesis created the song, can't pronounce it in Spanish, and dance that spread around the globe with its final line, quote, "The rapist is you." With those street performances, protests, you really managed to show the world that when it comes to patriarchy, no one is innocent and everyone should take the time to analyze their own behavior, as well as the institutions around them, and then act. And I get a warm feeling thinking of Nellie throwing the ripe tomato with the proficiency of someone who has done nothing but throw tomatoes all of her life, that hit the Nazi leader on the head at the perfect second in front of a big crowd in Finland. And they go on, but I'll just read them a little bit later. They keep going on with a whole bunch of other. As friends have pointed out, we're like a mix of magnificent things that those working against us have difficulty understanding. They can't imagine fierceness and care inhabiting the same person, much less a social body that fights to dismantle hierarchies according to ethical principles of shared power. Love is not keeping your hands clean. Love is courage. When an event with people with strollers and walkers gets attacked, anyone who rushes to absorb the first blows and actively defend them, despite the consequences that might continue for 1, 2, 4, 7, or even 10 years, is defending love. To be honest, the reason I'm writing to you is because it becomes more and more clear to me every day that we belong together in one way or another. And I want you to remember that even though sometimes, and perhaps often, you feel lonely, you are loved. I'm certain of this. I know it deep down. That is why I'm writing to you, from the many places where I know this to be true, from the moments and movements where I have experienced it and felt it to be true. Love as a constant practice. Thanks. We'll go to the spot. Okay. So I know it's a little late, so maybe we either wrap up or we can just hang out and have a little chat with each other, whichever seems appropriate. I want to keep people.
Yeah, I think since we have sort of a virtual audience and an in-person audience, I think we'll say goodnight to our virtual audience. Thank you all so much for being with us. I want to encourage you to click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Constellations of Care, Anarcha-Feminism in Practice. Now you have a nice little sampler of the ideas in there so you can know what you're getting. And we will have some signed copies. So if you would like to order a signed copy, you can just do that. Thank you all so much for being with us. We really